My story starts with me hanging out with my friends on the football field. I was part of my school's marching band, and our marching band director was a bit of an alcoholic. He would pretty often leave in the middle of practice, I'm guessing because he wanted to go feed his addiction, and he would tell us to keep practicing while he was gone. We never did, and we had a lot of fun because of it. Even though the rest of my story makes up pretty much about the most horrifying events of my life, some of my fondest memories really were made on that field. This was just another of those times. The director left practice and he was going off into his car in the parking lot. I heard a soft screeching noise came from the fort. I didn't even think anything about it, so I didn't mention it to my friends. We were too busy tossing my friend Billy's frisbee around, and it only really came up when one of my other friends, Tom, imitated the sound by basically shrieking when he fumbled the frisbee one time, and we all laughed. So I guess we all heard it, but it didn't seem like a big deal. Around an hour later is when this really all started. A rat came out of the grass from the direction of the fort. Tom did his screech when he pointed at it, we all chuckled, until we saw that it was headed directly for Billy. I'm gonna have some trouble describing what happened after that, partially because I think my mind just blocked it all out, so it all just comes to me in bits and pieces I kind of have to assemble together mentally instead of having them come in order, but for the most part I just remember that I was helpless. Or maybe not helpless, but I didn't help. If there was something I could do, I didn't do it. The rat barreled forward directly into Billy's leg, and when it leapt into the air on the way to smacking directly into it, it seemed for just an instant that it was diving into a pool of water. It was like his femur didn't give any resistance at all. The rat's head sank straight into his leg, through the bone and into the flesh, and then suddenly slowed down as if the friction from its nose burying itself into his flesh was the same as if it was trying to swim through maple syrup. Billy fell to the ground as it frantically wriggled its feet and pushed itself deeper and deeper in. I don't know how long it took Billy to scream. I think at first he was just surprised without really thinking about what was happening or how impossible it seemed. But then, he started really screaming. The rat was in up to its chest, just fully submerging itself in his leg with his skin wrapping around it, so tightly stuffed in there that barely a drop of his blood was getting onto its fur. Another of our friends dove onto his knees and grabbed onto the rat's legs as they squirmed in his hand. I could tell right away that this was a bad idea. Billy's eyes opened wide the second my friends tried to start pulling the rat out. It had no effect other than to bring him excruciating pain. The rat crawled further in no matter how hard he pulled, and Billy writhed on the ground crying for my friend to stop, which he did, eventually. Tom ran to get someone to call the police at that point, and I watched helplessly as Billy clawed at the grass as the rat fully submerged itself into his leg, starting to crawl up towards his knee. The only part of it I could see being its tail sticking out of his raw, exposed flesh. Eventually an ambulance arrived and took Billy away, as I closed my eyes and wished for the whole situation to go away. So those are the bits and pieces I was able to put together with this whole situation. Most of all, I remember feeling the grass in my hands as I watched the whole thing happen. I felt like there was nothing else I could think about. That and his scream. I'll never forget his scream. We didn't hear anything about him for days. Even his parents didn't seem to really understand what was going on with him when I called them to reach out. They just said he was in the hospital and that nobody was permitted to see him because of a potential contagious disease. Around the 5th day, we were allowed to see him. They amputated his leg and told everyone that it was because of rabies. They all said the rat was rabid and attacked him and that they had to amputate before it spread to the rest of the body. I didn't believe this for a second, and none of my friends did either. I asked Billy if he really believed this, and he just shrugged. I guess after all he went through, he wasn't really willing to put in the effort to question it. At this point in my life, I guess I've just accepted that I'm never going to really understand what happened with the rat. Sometimes I wonder if it really was just a regular rat bite, and I made the whole thing up in my head because of how traumatic the situation was. But then I remember his screams, and I know that there's no other way it could have happened. Me and my marching band went through a lot together. We went to school in a town small enough that when certain things happened, everybody heard about it. So pretty soon after it started happening, we started hearing about something strange happening in the forest. The forest was a place we were always told not to go to, unless we had permission. Of course, that made us always want to go there a little, but since it was a place even adults stayed away from, it seemed like a bad enough idea that we never really made the trip. That changed when we started hearing rumors about screeching noises coming from the woods. I'd lived in the town for a while, so I knew that this was new. And the way people talked about it, it seemed like people genuinely had no idea what was causing it. Some people started complaining that it was waking them up at night. Me and my marching band friends had all heard it at one point ourselves, that one time when we were supposed to be practicing. It sounded a bit like a whistle, or like a train screeching to a stop. That time my friends and I had heard it, an unusual rat came out of the woods. It must have had some kind of infection or parasite attached to it. We were all teenagers, so we didn't believe in coincidences. Whatever was going on with that rat, it was because of those sounds, and it was happening in the forest. So for the first time in our lives, my marching band friends and I decided to wait for our director to leave practice, and then we made our way out into the forest. At first, there was a pattern of us thinking we heard screeching and then coming to the conclusion that it was just the wind. If there was any screeching going on, it wasn't loud enough to be the same kind of screeching we'd been hearing before, at least. We all started to regret not bringing flashlights as the sun went down and the trees got thick enough that we were struggling to see any light coming from the town. We still weren't hearing screeching, or really anything other than the wind. But then, I started to realize that was kind of strange. I would have expected at least some kind of animal noises, like crickets chirping or an owl howling or anything, but it was just dead silent. The only sound of life in that forest were the trees watching over us. My friends didn't think that this was strange when I pointed it out to them, and we kept going forward. Slowly, as we started getting pretty far in, it started. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but it kept building and building, until we all noticed, and it was undeniable. The screeching. We all shouted with excitement and started running further into the forest, trying to chase the sound as it faded away. And after a little bit, it was too quiet for any of us to be able to follow it any further. We stood around arguing about which way to go next, when I noticed my foot kicked something that didn't feel like a rock. I looked down and had to squat to really make out what I was looking at. It was a full-sized, dead raccoon. It was so fresh that I swore it could have died 5 minutes ago. Its glassy eyes stared straight ahead, and there was something lodged in its side. I looked closer and realized that the legs of a squirrel were pointing out of it, but it didn't look like they'd entered a pre-existing hole or anything. The squirrel's skin was wrapped around the raccoon's side. It looked like some kind of extremely twisted taxidermy project. I shouted for my friends to check it out, but they were all already squatted over something else. I ran over to look and saw that they were staring at another squirrel, lodged in the middle of a bird, so its legs stuck out one end and its head poked out the other, its dead black eyes bulging as its neck's fur was pressed out into feathers. The feathers of the bird had somehow merged with the squirrel's fur at some point, and it looked like they were fighting over the territory so fiercely that they gave the skin some kind of irritation, like razor burn. And then, another friend of mine let out a shout. He was staring at something a few feet away. I ran over to look, and it was pretty jarring. A crack had formed in the ground, with one part of the earth sliding upwards like it was the result of an earthquake, and I kept catching wisps of some black smoke seeping out, making the air shimmer or shift back and forth in some weird sort of pattern. "We should get out of here," I shouted, and my friends agreed right away. Whatever that smoke was, we could all tell it was bad news. That's all we investigated of the forest. I never found out what was going on there, really. I'm just glad we noticed the smoke and left when we did, because the image of me and my friends, all mangled together against our will, gives me chills to this day. My marching band friends and I were running out of the forest when we finally saw a real source of light for the first time in around 30 minutes. But it wasn't the light from the town. It was light from police sirens, and we immediately could hear police radios and officers talking to each other as they got closer and closer. My friends and I were not fans of the police, and we definitely didn't want to get caught being out on our own at this time, so we all started running. I ran off to the side on the right while they all ran deeper into the forest. The police chased them far into the trees as I made it away without anyone noticing, and eventually I was back out in the boring flat fields True Town was known for. I was walking back to school, nervous about whether my friends would get caught and especially about whether they were going to snitch on me. Eventually, when I reached the football field where we were supposed to be practicing, I realized something much more serious than I thought was going on. The field was surrounded by cop cars with their lights on, making it hard to see what was actually happening. When I got a little closer, I noticed that there were a group of officers huddled around the center of the field, and I caught a glimpse of a shovel in one of their hands. It was hard for me to make out what was going on, but I got a bad feeling that told me I really shouldn't go up and ask. I started jogging off to the right to try and make my way home, glad that I had brought my trumpet with me so I wouldn't have to leave it behind, when I noticed a woman I recognized talking to one of the officers. She was the mother of my friend Tom, and she looked concerned. I crept closer and squatted behind a cop car to try and listen in to hear what they were saying. "We are hearing reports of a drunk driving incident just outside of town. I'm sorry, ma'am. We'll let you know what state your son is in as soon as we have the information," I heard the officer say. My stomach dropped. Why would he be telling this woman her son was dead? In a drunk driving accident, too. It didn't make sense, but I was starting to realize that my friends and I really shouldn't have gone into the forest. There was something going on that we weren't supposed to see, and we saw it. I ran home as fast as I could, and the longer I ran, the more I was sure of it. I didn't know yet if any of my friends made it out of the forest, but I was sure that nothing good happened to the ones that were caught. I tucked myself into bed without my parents noticing me come in, and that night, a police officer came knocking on our door. At first, my mom told the officer that I was out at band practice, but I came out of my room at that moment, looking confused, and told them I had come home early that day because I was feeling sick. The officer told me that all of my marching band friends had died in a drunk driving incident, and that I had his condolences. I broke down and started crying. I knew he was telling the truth, that my friends were really dead, but both he and my mom of course thought that I believed him. He ended up leaving, and my mom tried to comfort me, but I pushed her away because there was no way to communicate what really happened to them. Nobody was ever going to believe me. When I went to school the next day, they'd blocked the whole football field off as a quote-unquote crime scene, but I saw at the center that there was a patch of grass that looked fresher than the rest, like it was just planted there. They blocked off the forest for a week after that, too. The screeching stopped after that night. I don't think anyone ever heard it again. There were no more reports of animals doing whatever they were doing, at least not that I heard of. It was like everything just went back to normal after that night, except that I had lost all my closest friends, and I would never have anyone to talk to about it. At least, not until you.